Today, I'm going to be creating the highest order and one of the craziest mods I have ever made. That's right, I'm going to glue hundreds of Legos onto a 9x9 and see what happens. But that is a lot easier said than done. So before we get too ahead of ourselves, I want to walk you through why I'm making this mod, what exactly I'm going to be making, and how I'm going to do it, because there's a lot more that goes into making a mod like this than you might think. If you've watched my channel for a while, you'll know that I love combining Legos with Rubik's Cubes. At the most basic level, that means taking a normal Rubik's Cube and gluing colored Legos onto the outside as if they were stickers. Of course, you could go a little bit more hardcore and make the entire Rubik's Cube mechanism out of nothing but Legos. Check out that recent video if you haven't already, but needless to say, that's going to hurt the turning performance just a little bit. So sticking with the slightly better turning of the two options, I decided to make not just a Lego 4x4, but also a 2x2 and a 1x1 to finish off my Lego Cube collection with these 2x2 plates. Now, of course, the hardest part of making a cube like this is just finding a cube to start out with that's the exact right size. Like, for example, most 4x4s nowadays are way too small to fit 2x2 Lego plates on. So instead, I had to compromise with a super old, terrible Rubik's 4x4, and I actually had to sand down the pieces a little bit to make sure that it was fully bingeable, like this, which just made the turning even worse. Luckily, the 3x3 turns alright, as does the 2x2 and, of course, the 1x1. But long story short, making all those modifications got me excited about Lego cubes again, and I wanted to see how I could push the limits even further. Obviously, a 5x5 would not be possible with 2x2 Lego plates because the pieces are just way too small, but at the same time, it also wouldn't be possible with 1x1 plates because they're too big. So the next obvious choice would be the 6x6. Let's check it out, and it turns out the pieces are still a little bit too big. Okay, then how about the 7x7? Well, we're actually getting really close to the pieces fitting perfectly, but they still are just a tiny bit too big. Plus, because these outer layers are now disproportionate, you can see that we'd have a really ugly border running all around the outside of the cube. So far, it's not looking too good for this higher order Lego cube, unless you want to go with an ugly looking 7x7. That was until I came across this cube right here, the Yushin Little Magic 9x9. This thing is absolutely massive. It feels like a brick in my hands, and as a size comparison, here is my other 9x9, and here is a 13x13, basically the exact same size. So apparently Yushin made a massive 9x9. So what? Well, according to my research, the pieces on this cube should be perfect for making a 1x1 plate Lego cube, and there's even a little detail that you might have already noticed that should make this Lego cube a lot less ugly than the theoretical 7x7 I was just talking about. But first, I mean, look at this thing. Even without Legos, it's already one of the coolest cubes that I own, so let's go ahead and do some first turns and see how it works. It's actually very smooth on every single layer, a little bit tight on that inner one. It's a $35 cube, around the same as the Mofeng Xiaoxi. I would say that the turning is comparable on the two cubes, but unless you have really massive hands, I would say you're probably gonna have a lot more fun turning this cube because the Yushin is just ridiculously massive. But that fits our purposes here today perfectly because a 1x1 Lego plate will fit on each of these pieces just about perfectly. But that's not the only reason we're using this cube. Otherwise, I just would have stuck with the 7x7. What makes this cube in particular special is that the outer layers, which are always disproportionate on bigger cubes, are actually the exact same size as a 2x2 plate. So what that means is that we can use 1x1s on all of these inner pieces here, 2x2s on the 4 outer corners, as well as 1x2s on all of these inner edge pieces. If you think about it, it's actually pretty unlikely that a cube like this would exist, being the exact right size on the inner layers down to a couple tenths of a millimeter and exactly double that on all of the outer pieces. So this should basically be the best higher order Lego cube I could hope for. Now, the process of making the cube itself isn't as easy as just buying a whole bunch of Legos, buying the cube, and then gluing them all on there, and that's because of a big problem called catching. It's the reason that this 100% Lego cube doesn't turn that great, even though the mechanism is pretty much perfect. The Legos just catch on each other because they're so square. If we just went ahead and glued all these pieces straight onto the 9x9, you could expect to have this level of catching times 100 because there'd be so many little pieces to catch against each other. So that is why, as painful as it may be, we're gonna have to break out the sandpaper and round down the edges of all of our Legos, just like I've done on all of my previous Lego cubes, so that the corners are rounded enough to not catch constantly while you're turning. Except that for a 9x9, we now have 9 times as many pieces to sand down. So you may think that gluing each and every one of these pieces precisely onto the cube would be the time-consuming part of this mod, but I expect that to be a breeze compared to the sanding. For that reason, I've gotten myself some moderately rough sandpaper that should knock off those edges pretty quickly, and then I've got some slightly finer sandpaper to smooth it all out in the end. I'm definitely not going to do quite as much sanding as I have on my previous Lego cubes because these things are really rounded. I think all I really have to do is enough rounding to match the rounding that's already there on the piece pieces of the 9x9, which shouldn't be that much, but with so many pieces, it's still going to be extremely time consuming. Next comes the gluing, which like I said, should be the easy part after that. I think the way I'm going to do it with such a big cube is because you have to glue on each Lego individually anyway, I'm just going to take apart the entire thing. That way I can physically hold the pieces and the Legos together to line them up rather than trying to do it by eye, which would just be a pain. I also know that a lot of Yushin big cubes have these little caps on all the pieces, so if it's as easy as that to pop them all off, then I might just go ahead and glue the Lego straight onto the piece underneath the cap, because it takes a piece of complexity out of the puzzle. Oh, and if you've made it this far into the video, then clearly you enjoy my channel at least a little bit, so if you're still in the 92% of people who aren't subscribed, then definitely go ahead and hit that button. It really helps me out. Anyway, I think that's pretty much all the steps for making the Lego 9x9. It's going to be a lot of work, many hours, so let's go ahead and get started with the time lapse. Alright, that was the longest time lapse I have done in a long time. What you just saw there amounted to almost exactly 10 hours of work, and that doesn't include a lot of stuff that I did off camera. It started with the sanding, which honestly wasn't too bad, about what I was expecting, and luckily partway through I discovered that you could stack up the Legos and sand a whole bunch of them at once, rather than doing each one individually. I stacked up all the smaller pieces into groups of 7, off camera, which took longer than you'd think, and then just sanded them as one big brick at a time. It's definitely not nearly as fast as sanding one individually, but it's also not 7 times slower, so it saves a bit of time. And the bigger advantage is that it makes the sanding more consistent, because every single piece you're sanding with a whole bunch of others, and you can spend more time on them. And so as you can see, the rounding on those pieces is actually pretty good. It still took quite a few hours of work, and that's not even to mention how long it took to pry all the Legos apart at the end. That was painful. I would bet with all those off-camera bits that it probably totaled closer to 15 hours of work, because after that I then went ahead and cleaned up all the sanding, just made it look a little bit nicer, and then actually washed all the pieces and got all the dust off. And don't even get me started on removing the caps from all the pieces. The centers were super easy because they weren't glued on. The corners you did have to break off a little bit of plastic, but it wasn't too bad. But the edges took hours and hours of off-camera work because they were glued on super well from the factory. And then finally came the gluing, by far the most underestimated and the most painful part. It turns out there are a lot of pieces on a 9x9, and gluing a Lego onto each one individually, well, it takes a long time. Just to give you an idea, I would pick up a piece, which I had organized all of them off camera, grab my super glue, drop a little drop in all 4 corners, pick up a Lego of the correct color, put it in the correct orientation, stick it very carefully onto the piece, make sure it's super centered. Sometimes you'd get lucky and it would go on just perfectly centered the first time. Sometimes you'd be able to react quickly and nudge it over to the correct spot before the super glue dries in literally 2 seconds. Sometimes it won't work out, it'll just be way off center, so you have to take your knife, pry it off of there, and try it all again. But the one thing that remains constant is that you're always going to get super glue all over your fingers, and you'll be constantly leaving skin all over the sides of the pieces, which you'll have to make sure and cut off so that the cube actually turns properly. Oh yeah, and then you'll have to do that about 300 more times. On the bright side, assembling the cube was actually pretty easy, so there's that. Overall, I'm pretty happy with how all the pieces are glued on. Some of them are definitely more crooked than others, but for the most part, I think it looks about as good as I could have expected. I'm not really planning to bandage the cube by spanning larger plates across multiple of the pieces, but I think it definitely would be possible, like just doing that right there. I don't think you'd be able to take, say, a 1x10 brick and bandage it all the way across the cube, because all these little gaps here will probably add up and it probably wouldn't quite fit, but just bandaging 2 adjacent pieces is probably always possible. And overall, just taking everything in together, I love the look of this cube, especially with the 1x2 and 2x2 plates on the outer row. It just looks incredible, and I can't believe the size worked out perfectly. Like, there is no gap there whatsoever. Like any other cube I could have chosen, if it were smaller, I would have had to use all 1x1s, and there would have been a big gap there, like on the 7x7 I was talking about earlier. And if it were bigger, like an 11x11, which has actually been done before by someone named Ogre Cubes, there also would have been a big gap there because the outer layers are larger. So I just feel so lucky that I came across this cube that not only has the exact right thickness on the inner pieces, but also the exact right thickness on the outer pieces. So let's go ahead and get to the moment you've probably all been waiting for, the turning. So let's try it out. It turns, and surprisingly well actually. The Legos pretty much don't catch at all. There are a few layers, like the tight inner ones, that are a little bit catchy. That is to be expected because the alignment on some of those pieces wasn't perfect, but it's kind of more of a bumpiness than a catchiness. I think the rounding did a really good job, and yeah, there's really no major sharp corners catching on anything. Obviously, it does turn a little bit worse than how it started out, but I am more than happy with the result. It honestly turns better than I ever would have expected. The only real annoyance, which you've probably already noticed, is just in the size of the puzzle itself. As you can see, it takes quite a lot to fit your hand around the puzzle. It was a pretty big cube to begin with, and now it is even bigger. It did get a little bit smaller from taking off the caps, but the Legos are way bigger than the caps, and as you can see, now it is a touch bigger than the 13x13. So yeah, this is one massive puzzle, but it's also one good looking puzzle. Check out that checkerboard with the classic Lego colors. I love it. I could not be happier with the results, even if making this thing has been literally my entire life for the last 3 days. So yeah, I hope you all like this cube as much as I do, and I hope you all enjoyed this video a little more than I enjoyed making it. That's pretty much it, and I'll see you guys next time.